Hello and welcome back to Transfermarkt. My name is Matt and I'm joined by Stefan and Ben to discuss the future of Bayern Munich and Dutch centre-back Matthijs De Ligt. We heard early in the window that there are a number of players who Bayern are opening to listening to offers for, and De Ligt was among that list, and we've heard since that Manchester United could be interested in bringing the centre-back to Old Trafford. Stefan, I want to start first of all with the Bayern angle on this, because there were a few surprises on that list of players that they may be letting go this summer, and De Ligt certainly on top of that. Can you talk to us a little bit about the situation Bayern find themselves in now and why De Ligt could be on the way out?
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation. Of course, I'm sure most of our viewers will know that Vincent Kompany has been appointed new head coach at Bayern. A really interesting young head coach. Probably raised a few eyebrows, obviously, because of what he'd done in English football. But I think he comes to Bayern Munich with a very clear instruction to play possession football, very attacking, very dominant football. You know, he's a student of the kind of Pep Guardiola style of football, if you will, that we see at Man City. Obviously, Mikel Arteta does something very similar at Arsenal. That's what Bayern Munich want to play. They want to play high up the park. They want to play possession football. They want to play a style of football that more reminiscent of the kind of football they actually played under Pep Guardiola once upon a time. And as a result of that, there's a huge turnover of players expected this summer. And, you know, Bayern have their eyes set on some big players. They're also looking to sign Michael Olise at Crystal Palace. They're expected to pick up Xavi Simons from RB. He was on loan at RB Leipzig. He's technically a PSG player. And as a result, they're going to have to sell some players. And my opinion is that De Ligt isn't really up for sale simply because he's, you know, not wanted or that he's not considered good enough for Bayern Munich. But I just suspect he's probably the most sellable of Bayern Munich's central defenders. You know, there's obviously Eric Dyer, who, let's be honest, no one's going to be picking up this summer. Dayot Upamecano, who's an interesting one, who also moved to Bayern for a huge transfer fee from RB Leipzig, but he spent the last kind of 2 or 3 years really struggling for performances, really struggling for consistency, and it was actually dropped for much of last season by Thomas Tuchel. And equally, Kim Min-jae is a player who moved to the club last year from Serie A, put in some really decent performances, but then actually in the second half of the season really fell off a bit and looked like he really struggled with the kind of pace of German football. So you got two players there who, you know, still relatively young by central defensive or centre back standards, but still finding their feet. And then you have Matthijs de Ligt, who I think probably the three of them's probably been the most consistent as a Bayern Munich player, and perhaps most crucially in that kind of run to the Champions League semi-final, Thomas Tuchel really put all his trust in De Ligt. His centre-back pairings were De Ligt and, quite bizarrely, Eric Dyer, which was a statement about how much he didn't rely on Kim and Upamecano for these kind of big games, but also how much he did rely on De Ligt. And actually, if you head over to Transfermarkt and take a look at the market values, that's probably a pretty good example of, you know, how those three players have done in terms of, you know, their performances. So, for example, De Ligt, 65 million euros, Upamecano is 45 million euros, and Kim Min-jae is 45 million euros. So, long story short, I would really say that if Bayern Munich are looking to try and make some money this summer to kind of improve elsewhere in the team, because at the end of the day, they've got three solid central defenders there. They've also signed Hiroki Ito, who's a Stuttgart central defender, a very good player as well, who'll come in as a really solid backup there. And of course, Josip Stanisic, who's returned from Bayer Leverkusen on loan, who played right back for last season, but can play centre back naturally quite easily. So they've basically got an abundance of central defenders, and I think they've probably sat down and thought, who can we get the most money for this summer? And I think that player is probably Matthias De Ligt, because he has a bigger profile. He's the one who was in the spotlight the most for Bayern Munich last season when Thomas Tuchel was doing well in the Champions League. And if the English media reports are to be believed, has a kind of growing list of admirers as well.
Ben, turning your attention to Manchester United and their well-documented central defender woes from last season. Of course, we saw Casemiro feature quite heavily in their back four towards the end of the year as they contested injuries, and now with the loss of Raphael Varane, it seems as though it's one of the priorities, and understandably one of the priorities for Erik ten Hag for next season.
Yeah, it's been a shambolic position last season for Man United, and certainly one of the first areas they need to address. We spoke about Braithwaite with the suggestions he could come in last week, and I just felt that wasn't quite the right profile, because if fit, Lisandro Martinez is one of the first names on that Man United team sheet, and he's a left centre-back. You need a right centre-back to come in and complement him. De Ligt does tick a lot of those boxes, and you could potentially see that as a good partnership between Martinez and De Ligt. One perhaps area for concern might be his lack of pace. If we look at the best defences, certainly in the Premier League over the last few seasons, they have had one sort of real out-and-out defender with raw pace. We've seen Kyle Walker play that role for Man City, where he essentially plays right centre-back. William Saliba at Arsenal and even Van Dijk at Liverpool over the last sort of five or 6 years. So I'd be a little bit concerned about that. I know Diego Dallo is quick, but he plays a more of an orthodox right-back role. He doesn't do that sort of covering position that Kyle Walker plays. So that could potentially be an area of concern with Martinez and De Ligt as a centre-back partnership. But I certainly think in terms of what they had, it would represent a much improved centre-back partnership than what we saw. I mean, it couldn't get much worse, could it, than what we saw last season with Casemiro and Johnny Evans. It would also represent Erik ten Hag bringing in another former Ajax player, which we've seen a lot of in recent seasons. And it's safe to say it hasn't quite worked out so far. I don't think anybody in the world would suggest Antony has been a success at Old Trafford. It looked like when Ineos come in, there's going to be this sort of new structure in terms of their recruitment and stuff, moving away from Erik ten Hag having direct say in that decision. I mean, he might not, but it's a bit of a coincidence again, isn't it, if this transfer does go through. I think if you can get him 50 million euros, that's 15 million less than his current market value of 65 million euros. He's still only 24 years old, which seems baffling because it seems about 10 years ago when he went on that run with Ajax, when they got to the Champions League semi-finals, and then that heartbreaking night for me when Spurs beat them. But so I think at 24 for 50 million euros, solid right centre back and come in and complement Lisandro Martinez. I see that as a positive transfer for Man United and one that fans could potentially be excited about ahead of the new season.
Stefan, the latest news on this one is that United, according to reports in the UK, have held initial talks with Bayern Munich to understand the conditions of a deal worth in the region of €50 million. And if that were to be the fee that De Ligt moved for this summer, he'd become the fifth most expensive player in footballing history in terms of accumulated transfer fees at just over €200 million. And given that he's had those two big moves in the past to both Juventus and Bayern Munich, why do you think Man United have pinpointed him as a main target for this summer?
I mean, it's definitely context that has to be added to this. You know, Man United fans have every right to say, well, if he didn't work at Juventus and Bayern Munich are now looking to sell him, then why would Man United want him? But I think Ben makes a really good point. He is still only 24 years old, which is really quite remarkable. And, you know, for a central defender, even in the modern era, that means if he can kind of really click into gear at Man United, that's at least 8 or 10 years that, you know, he could be a key player for the club going forward. You know, we've seen obviously Van Dijk at Liverpool going into his kind of mid-30s as well. And other players as well over the course of the Premier League. In fact, in the modern era, we're seeing across the board really players kind of really go on past the kind of age that we thought the peak they'd start to kind of fall off their peak. So he would definitely represent a younger style of player, and I think that's also been something that Man United have struggled with over the course of the last kind of 5-10 years, where they spent a lot of money, but it's usually on players who are 27, 28, 29, even 30. And once they arrive at Man United, they very quickly begin to diminish. You know, it's not long. We actually did an episode very recently on Man United, and Ewan spoke quite eloquently about how much Casemiro's really dropped off. Rafael Varane's perfect example of this, a player who maybe wasn't too old when he joined the club, but in terms of actually his injury history, he was obviously beginning to kind of wane in terms of what he could offer physically at the highest levels. So I think De Ligt would come into Man United as a player much younger than they're used to signing. And I think it's also worth noting that, you know, things didn't work out Juventus for him, but things haven't really worked out for anyone at Juventus for a number of years now. They're not exactly at the top of their game. And as I mentioned at the top of the show here, even if he does leave Bayern Munich this summer, that's not to suggest he hasn't done well. I think he probably was their best central defender last season, to be perfectly honest with you. And maybe Vincent Kompany, as a former central defender, thinks he can maybe do more with Upamecano and Kane. Maybe he can mould more out of them going forward. But I think De Ligt would be an outstanding signing for Man United, and one that they could rely on for years to come as well.
Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you think this happens?
I think potentially, yeah. If we look at a 50 million transfer fee, I think it ticks a lot of boxes for Man United. As we mentioned, he's 24. In the modern transfer market, it's not a lot of money compared to what we see other players go for. So, yeah, I can see this transfer going through this summer.
Let us know in the comments if you think this is one that Manchester United could get over the line this summer. If you have enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more of this content throughout the summer transfer window. But for now, Thanks for watching.